I made a poll asking people how they progress in regards to grouping, solo, and that kind of stuff. And despite the small sample size, I was really surprised by the results, particularly in regards to how many of you solo. I honestly expected that part of the poll to get like maybe 5% or less. After all, so many people are always clamoring for the return of party quests and things like that, things to do with groups. But if you noticed, all of my boss guides, for the most part, are labeled solo and come from a solo player's perspective. That's because I am pure solo. That means that I want my first time kill achievement and my solo achievement to be the exact same date for every boss. Unfortunately, that's kind of ruined from a purist perspective because I have Pierre and Crimson Queen killed in a party. But oh well, everything past that is pure solo. And let me tell you, it's not always the easiest. The reason I want those two achievements to be synced up is because it pretty much proves that I am going solo. Because my philosophy on bossing is that if you can solo a boss, you should be. Most important boss drops and especially pitch boss accessories are already so incredibly rare that you really don't want to be splitting the drop rate for that unless you have to. After all, if you're not capable of soloing a boss and killing it with 2, 3, 4, 5, however many people it takes, it's a lot better than doing something like killing normal Guardian of Slime, which has a drop rate that is borderline non-existent for the ring. One thing many jaded old MapleStory players like to say is, oh, this game doesn't require parties anymore, you can just solo everything, and while that is technically true, again, I can't stress how hard some things are going to be. I gotta imagine a lot of people underestimate just how significant adding one extra person can be. Even better when you actually start to build a well-formed party around like a bishop or another support class that's really strong. Of course, you can make things a little bit easier on yourself by picking a very good class. I didn't pick Dawn Warrior specifically for this. I've been maining the class ever since Reboot came out, and it just so happens that after the rework, they're kind of monsters. And for the most part, any of the classes that you usually hear are really good as boss mules are going to be good in solo progression. You know, classes like Buccaneer, Demon Slayer, Dawn Warrior, Hero, Bowmaster, Wind Archer, the usual suspects. And then if you want an extremely easy time, you can try to do it with classes like Paladin or Mahil. The neat thing about those two classes is you don't even need to learn mechanics for most of the bosses in the game. Unless they have something strict that you need to follow like Varus Hilla, you can just ignore everything. There are of course other bosses too, but I'm not going to list everything. One thing that I always encourage people to do is if you don't think you can solo a boss or you're wondering, is go try. With the removal of buff freezers and soon to be the removal of boss entry limits altogether, bossing is more accessible than ever. Pretty soon, practice mode, even though it's getting buffed up significantly, is borderline going to be worthless. When there's no entry limit and no buff freezers to worry about consuming, there's no harm in just going in and trying. All you're going to do is spend some time. Maybe some Monster Park potions, and maybe some other buffs if you have something like an Onyx Apple, but you know, don't waste an Onyx Apple on a boss that you're unsure that you can even kill in the first place. And the most important thing I can tell you about solo progression is get in a good guild. Make sure that the guild you're joining at minimum has crit damage maximized and preferably boss damage or damage percent, but damage percent makes more sense since it's the exact same value. If you can manage to get in a guild that has all three, even better. When you're bossing solo, buffing is more important than ever, especially when you're trying to progress into new things. However, if you're partying, yeah, you can pretty much just get away with guild buffs and maybe Monster Park potions if you're feeling like it. Here are some things you should know when you are going solo progression. The most basic is that you need to accept that you're going to progress slower than people who do groups. For example, when you get to Hard Lucid and Hard Will, people in groups will have been doing those bosses for quite some time and at a much earlier stat than you are capable of doing. And while they may not have gotten many things like Twilight Marks or whatever out of it, they definitely got quite a few free arcanes. There are many players who actually entirely get their arcane from boxes alone, and solo players, you just don't really have that option. Unless that is you decide to invest more into Absolab and go up to 20 star plus on that. That, however, for the most part is going to require soloing Hard Damien and Hard Lotus, unless that is you've had a lot of time as a boss mule under your belt or just exists for a while and have a ton of drops from normal. And in that case, oh my god, you better learn to love Haven and Dark World Tree weeklies because you're going to be doing a lot of them. I would never do that. Not in a million years. Haven weeklies can burn in hell, you know, the place where they were created. The next thing is, and I already mentioned this, is you need to become acquainted with buffing and get every single little buff you can to increase your character's power. I even made a video just for that purpose because again, this is stuff I need to do. I needed to learn this, so putting the info out there for everybody else. Next, care about every little bit of power your character can get. That means maxing out nodes that give you a little bit of stat boost, making sure your hyper stats are properly balanced, making sure you don't have too much ignore enemy defense, which that's something everybody should be doing, but again, you need to get every little bonus you can when you're solo because you're alone. Ain't nobody else gonna pick up the slack for you not doing enough damage. Speaking of, let's talk about some of the more difficult walls you are going to hit. There are two main types of bosses that are going to hinder your your progression in different ways. There are the damage sponge bosses that just take an overwhelming amount of DPS to beat and for the most part are not going to threaten your life. These are bosses like Damien, Chaos Guardian Angel Slime, Gloom, and even Lucid to a degree on hard difficulty. Then there are the walls, the ones that are going to really stop you in your tracks and keep you there for probably quite a while. These are bosses like Hard Lotus with his billion pieces of debris he rains on your head every second. Will with just everything he does. He is a very mechanically intensive fight, and if you mess it up, you're not going to beat it no matter how much damage you have. Darknell, because he's just Magnus on roids, like his fight is insane. There's so much happening and it's very easy to die. Varishilla, and then everything of course that comes beyond Tenebris, which I've yet to touch so far. Now the damage sponges are challenging in their own way. Hard Damien, for example, is not a difficult fight to survive in by any means, especially if you have any reasonable amount of experience with normal. Having the damage to actually take him down in the appropriate amount of time when he spends half of the fight just evading you is a very challenging thing in of itself. But then you have his counterpart Lotus, which it's pretty unlikely you're ever going to get timed out by Lotus because it's also just pretty unlikely you're going to survive that long. No matter how much you know that fight, it is very easy to make one little mistake and then that leads to you getting hit by 5 different things and you dying. Thankfully with 6th Job now, you have the ability to easily get past Damien and things just by grinding, whereas before 6th Job existed, most people at that point probably have their nodes pretty much maxed out, most of the important things should be taken care of, and it's really hard to grind power. You need Meso, and more importantly, you generally need to wait for Shining Star Force events, which as most people know, generally only happen twice a year. Then comes the problem of don't save your money for too long, because if you are just on the edge of being able to beat a new boss that is very important for progression, let's say Chaos Guardian Angel Slime, you don't want to wait 6 months for the next Shining Star Force to be able to start doing it, when maybe you could have spent your money a couple months in, been a little bit less efficient Meso-wise, but had 4 more months of Guardian Angel Slime under your belt. Unfortunately, there is no hard and fast rule I can tell you on that. That is something you need to feel out for yourself. If you're doing Chaos Guardian Angel Slime and you are only failing by maybe 5%, well, maybe it's time to spend. Or alternatively, just grind more of 6th Job, assuming you're 260. With the addition of 6th Job, grinding is more valuable to progression than ever. Before 6th Job, I actually barely grinded at all. I mostly just leveled off of dailies and stuff. But 6th Job has really motivated me to start grinding. Not only that, but I actually just need more levels to be able to solo Black Mage. And with that, I'm going to go into talking about my own experiences. Again, I didn't decide on going pure solo, but that's the way it ended up, and that's what I'm committed to now. At the moment, I am doing Chaos Tenebris bosses. I haven't really tried anything beyond that because I'm not really too keen on like pushing really hard. I tend to take a very lazy approach to my progression. Sometimes it's a lot to think about taking on a new boss. When I broke into Hard Damien and Hard Lotus was a very difficult mechanical fight. That was tough to learn. I failed a lot, failed all 3 attempts for several days in a row. Some weeks I failed it entirely because I waited until like the last 1 or 2 days before reset and I just didn't have enough attempts. So don't make that mistake. Always do your bosses early, even though there are many superstitious people who think that bossing on reset day is bad luck. Meanwhile, Damien, the damage sponge, well, that just took me about 28 minutes to clear per week. And at one point I just decided I wasn't going to do anymore because I didn't want to do that every week. There's an awful lot to spend that much time fighting Damien, a very annoying boss to fight. Very shortly after doing them, I eventually added Lucid to the mix. Will, that took a little bit of time. One, I was underleveled. I was almost at a complete final damage penalty against him at that time. I was also just very intimidated by his mechanics. There was a lot going on compared to all previous fights. And here's where things really started to slow down in terms of solo progression, because getting every piece of arcane gear through drops alone takes forever when you're just doing normal. Not to mention the fact that breaking into Hard Lucid solo is incredibly challenging, especially if you are not a very bursty class. And Hard Will really isn't any better. Phase 3 is really easy or really hard depending on how much DPS you have. But if you are completely alone, keeping those webs at bay becomes nigh impossible near the end. After those two, it's a couple DPS checks. Chaos Guardian Angel Slime, while a lot more threatening than regular, is still a relatively easy fight to survive in as long as you're paying attention. However, when you're breaking into it for the first time, expect a long fight. My first clear, I think, was 29 minutes. I even had like Wild Hunter buffs and stuff. That one was a struggle, and it was just before 6th Job. Chaos Gloom is more or less the same thing, just, a lot more threatening, I would say, but still relatively easy as long as you're paying attention, not being too greedy. Then there's the hard one. Darknell. By this time, you likely should have been doing normal around the same time you started doing hard Damien and hard Lotus. They're around the same progression, you know, just Darknell's higher level, so your level needs to be appropriate. Darknell is easily one of the most threatening fights before you get into like the serious stuff like Saren and Kalos and Black Mage, which I can't even speak on yet. Breaking into hard Darknell was by far my hardest challenge, which is crazy because if I actually survived and when I got my first clear, a kill only takes about 10 minutes, which really just emphasizes how dangerous his fight is. Just like hard Lotus, I failed and failed and failed and failed on this, like 3 failed attempts every day, several days in a row, until I finally got him about, I think it took me 2 weeks. Didn't try every single day, but there was probably a good like 12, 15 attempts with like full buffs in there, which is pretty crazy for like, that's not a lot of attempts, but for a 10-minute clear like that, I'm failing a lot in 10 minutes. Still easy to die on that fight. As for what's next, I mean, like I'll probably start doing like Saren and stuff soon. Now that my level is finally getting up there, my Sacred Force, I actually have access to these bosses. Not only that, I won't have a complete final damage penalty against them, and that goes a long way. As for things like my gear, my nodes, my 6th job and stuff, that stuff should have been playing in the background at this point. So with that, I don't think I have anything else to ramble about. So, you know, I guess thanking you for watching. Thank you to my members, my patrons for supporting me as always, and I'll see you in the next one.